very large. Michael's a fourth-year undergraduate studying public relations. Michael's experience going through school with learning disabilities showed him how separating students in the classroom can perpetuate existing misconceptions. Today, Michael explores how we can change the misconceptions about learning disabilities and give students access to the resources they need. Take it away, Michael.
It was a normal Saturday afternoon. I was about 4 to 5 years old, and I did what any 4 to 5-year-old would with an abundance of free time on their Saturday afternoon. I decided to play hide and go seek with my best friend in the whole wide world, Graham Deaton. So here is a picture of 4 or 5-year-old Michael Banks. Get the oohs and the ahs out now. And so Graham and I had begun to play hide and go seek. We had traversed all over the neighborhood, hid behind cars and trash cans, maybe behind a fence or two, and eventually it was my turn to count. It was my turn to do the seeking. Now for most children this would be a daunting task, but for me it seemed like an arithmetic feat. And so I buckled down because I wanted to keep playing that game of hide and go seek with my best friend. And so I started counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, I paused for a minute. I couldn't quite get there. I don't know what it was about getting to the number 10 in that sequential order, but I couldn't quite do it. I couldn't quite figure out what the next number was, but I wanted desperately to keep playing. And so I buckled back down, calm, cool, collected, started counting to 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'd gotten to the number 6 this time. I must just be missing something. Maybe there was a number in between 5 and 6 that I wasn't quite getting. Maybe there was something right after it. I couldn't quite figure out what I was doing wrong. And at this point, my friend Graham had peeked out from behind the fence he was hiding behind and started to get a little bit curious as to what was unraveling while I was trying to count the number 10. I didn't want to have to deal with it, so one last time I tried to count 1 to 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I had made it to the number 7, and I wouldn't make it further that day. Pretty soon my friend Graham had run back over, started bantering, making fun of me a little bit, and as any 4 or 5-year-old would, tears just began rolling down my face. That was the only response that I had, so I ran inside, slammed the door behind me, and in between the tears and the snot bubbles, tried to explain to my mom what exactly had happened. And eventually she found out that I couldn't count to the number 10. And so this wasn't just an isolated discovery where I found out that I couldn't count 1 to 10. It was actually the beginning of a series of discoveries for me and my mother especially, who realized that I had a variety of moderate to severe learning disabilities. Those included dyslexia, anxiety. I showed very, very slow processing speeds and retrieval memories. And most notably for the purpose of this story, I realized that I had various troubles with sequential words such as 1 to 10, 10 to 20. And I had a lot of trouble trying to associate the phonetic spelling of a word, T-E-N, with its numerical value, 1, 0. And so before we dive in, I want to make very clear today what we are talking about. Sometimes people get the terms learning disability and intellectual disability confused, whereas they're two very distinct things. So a learning disability is traditionally defined as a disorder with one of the basic psychological processes which impedes reading, writing, arithmetic, and it can manifest itself in a variety of different ways. Now, an intellectual disability is a little bit different than that. An intellectual disability is defined as having significant characteristics which show trouble with intellectual functionality and adaptive behavior, which influences many everyday practical and social skills. Now, many people like to believe that when a child is defined as having a learning disability, that correlates directly with a lower IQ, when the reality of the situation is that children with learning disabilities often have average or above average IQs, but there's still a lot of misconceptions swirling around the idea of what exactly a learning disability is and how exactly we need to treat it. And so I wasn't foreign to these ideas of misconceptions. I knew that when it took me 2 hours to finish a test in first grade, it took most children only one, that there was something that was a little bit different, and I didn't know quite how to process that. And as I grew older, I began to see more misconceptions. These misconceptions that we have of learning disabilities perpetuate the classroom separation of students with learning disabilities that is very common to the educational systems in the U.S. Now, I know for myself that this was very frustrating, and there's a lot of people that commentate on this, one of those being educational reformer Madeline C. Will. She has this beautiful quote. She says, "At the heart of the special approach is the presumption that students with learning problems cannot be effectively taught in a regular educational program, even with a variety of support." I think that even with a variety of support is a very important concept, because that's one of the misconceptions that we buy into. And I would argue that in my story, I'm one of the exemptions to that misconception. Very early on, my mother noticed these learning disabilities, and I enrolled in a private school. At that private school, I was able to be integrated into classes that had students with learning disabilities and without. There was both. It wasn't that separation that we constantly see in educational settings. And I think it's because of that inclusivity and that accessibility to resources outside of the immediate environment of the classroom that I was able to have success in my own educational endeavors and not enjoy learning. And so this makes the question arise, what do we do for these students that have learning disabilities? And I think it's not a different classroom that these students want. It's not an entirely separated environment. Rather, it's accessibility. It's not attention that students want. It's accessibility. And so how do we make a push or a strive for this in our educational systems and in our educational settings? Well, we do that by pointing people towards the resources that are already available to them. Make the public aware of pre-existing resources. My brother attended the University of Georgia back in 2007, and one thing that he noticed very early on is that he was having trouble finishing his test. He had grown up with dyslexia and ADHD and struggled a little bit in grade school and elementary, but it was nothing that he couldn't ever overcome. And yet he got to college and he was doing very, very well in the first half, maybe the first 75% of the test, and yet he wasn't finishing the final leg. He was really struggling in some of his classes, and eventually one of his teachers noticed this. They pointed him towards our very own Disability Resource Center at UGA. Now, many people know that we have a Disability Resource Center. We know that the building actually exists, but how does it actually function? What does it actually do? A lot of people know that this is a physical location and that it offers services, but few people know the breadth of what the Disability Resource Center actually does and the plethora of resources that it actually provides. And that's what I want to emphasize. At the DRC from 2013 to 2014, among the students registered there, about 36% had ADHD. Another 20% had a psychological disorder such as anxiety. And yet another 16% had what we would traditionally define as a learning disability. And so if you look at the grand scheme of things, there's roughly 4,000 to 6,000 students at the University of Georgia that has a learning disability. Let's say that number is roughly 5,000. If we put that in a fraction, that's 1 out of 7 students at this university that has a learning disability. And I would argue that not all of those students know the resources that are already available to them. Certainly, not all of those 5,000 students are accessing the Disability Resource Center so that they can strive to go higher and higher in their educational career. If you're a student that traditionally struggles with learning disabilities, whether that's public or not public, don't be afraid to go to the resources that are available to you. They will help, I assure you of that. They have helped me. If you're someone who doesn't traditionally struggle with learning disabilities, yet you perceive learning from a variety of visual, verbal, and auditory needs, you might be able to help someone who has a learning disability or serve as a tutor for them. Learning disabilities aren't always as easy to spot as a child playing hide and go seek. Yet the more we implement standards of accessibility and inclusivity, the more children we'll hear saying 8, 9, 10. Thank you.